for those of you who don't know who I am, I see a lot of new names. Every session's a variety of different names pop up. I'm the ranger at Coronado Historic Site. And today I have manager Matt Barbour to pick his brain a little. We all see him all the time at the site. And we'll start with our first question. And this is kind of like the question I ask all the archaeologists I have on the program. Number one, how did you get your start in archaeology, Matt?
So I went to school for it as a young kid. For those of you who don't know, I actually was born in Massachusetts. My dad worked for the federal government. And shortly thereafter, we moved to the country of Panama. And while I lived on American soil in the Panama Canal Zone, I actually lived in Panama through most of my elementary school and part of my middle school life. During that time, several Indiana Jones movies came out, and I watched Indiana Jones and was inspired by the people and places around me. Got to go visit a lot of old Spanish forts. We'd spend our time moving between, we lived in Panama, but we would go back and forth between Puerto Rico, Panama, and Florida for quite a bit of time. And then I got to actually see a minor conflict compared to the conflicts of today, Just Cause, while I was down there, which would probably tell you about how old I am. Watched that, got inspired, ended up in New Mexico as they started to move U.S. personnel back to the States in the plans to change Panama back over to the Panamanian government. And my dad decided that he wanted to live in a place that was, he had choices as far as military or defense institutions he wanted to work for. And he felt most comfortable moving the family to a Hispanic area that would be at least similar to the culture. So that would be pretty far removed from Panama culture, Panamanian culture. We ended up in New Mexico. And I ended up moving out. He moved us. He didn't want us to live in a city. So we ended up moving out to the East Mountain area, out by Moriarty. And I attended middle school and high school in Moriarty before going for my first time to college to get my BA at UNM in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that's when I started my career in archaeology. I always knew I wanted to be an archaeologist. Just what involved being an archaeologist changed over time. If you were to ask my, under 10-year-old self, it involved fighting Nazis, which I was totally on board with. The reality is, I always loved history, and I was very good at social sciences in general.
Can you trace your education at UNM to where you're at right now?
Absolutely.
Our careers in archaeology evolve, and they just go down so many different paths. I think all of us archaeologists kind of go into it for very different reasons and come to that realization that we want to become an archaeologist. Like my realization was when I was a psych major and going to go into clinical psychology, and I somehow ended up here too.
See, mine was actually fairly straightforward. For those, I ended up at UNM, and I ended up as both an undergraduate and later as a graduate student, though that was years later. I ended up working under Anne Romanovsky. If you can believe it, at the time, I had long hair and was really into heavy metal. And Dr. Romanovsky wrote a book called Vectors of Death, which was a book that traced the depopulation of the Americas in statistical form. Many different case studies throughout the Americas looking primarily at population decline, presumably as a result of infectious disease spread in the 16th and 17th centuries. And that work was very pivotal to me. As I said, I liked all things dark and evil at that point, and I was super on board with it. And there was an opportunity to work with her out at San Marcos Pueblo it was in 2000. It was the year I turned 21. At any rate, so I ended up going out to San Marcos Pueblo and working there for part of the summer. And then I ended up going, after I was done working for her, I jumped on a plane and went out to Poland and worked out in Central and Eastern Europe for another couple months before I came back. But the work at San Marcos Pueblo was really pivotal because a year later, when I got out of school, I ended up doing some contract work for a while, but I applied for the state of New Mexico. And at the time they were getting ready to start, they needed hands to work on the Palace of the Governors. And Steve Post, who was at the time a project director at OAS, later on, Office for Archaeological Studies, later on he'd become deputy director, and he's retired now. He's still a great archaeologist working in the Santa Fe area. He brings me into his office, and I'm wearing a suit, and I've got a little suit on and stuff like that. And he asks me, well, what experience do you have? We're getting ready to deal with, early colonial New Mexico. And I said, well, I worked at San Marcos Pueblo, and it had a mission. And he said, so you're pretty familiar with historic archaeology? And I said, yes, absolutely. Which wasn't really the case. I mean, I'd done some historical archaeology, but primarily I've been focused on the indigenous peoples at San Marcos Pueblo, not on the mission. It was through that path that I also met Cordelia Snow, who ended up being very much a kind of an inspiration in my life as far as archaeologists go. And Dee Dee, or Cordelia Snow, is still working for Department of Cultural Affairs. So that ended up being my in, and I ended up working for the state, and I never looked back. I did a whole bunch of projects in downtown Santa Fe before kind of like going all throughout the state. I worked as a field member, a crew chief, project director, and then eventually into management positions at New Mexico Historic Sites. My career's with the state of New Mexico. I started in 2002, so it's about 18 years now.
How did your work outside of the country or even outside of the state, you mentioned that you went to Poland to do digs, how did that contribute to your kind of research here in the Southwest, if it did it?
Oh, it definitely did. Poland was actually, I don't want to say it was my second choice. I actually had an opportunity before that. I'd been gifted the opportunity to go work in Estonia, but I ended up cowering out of it. At the time, I hadn't met my wife yet. This was still a year before I was going to meet my wife, who has Finnish family. The problem with Estonia was I was under 21 when it happened, and I was offered the opportunity, and I chickened out because to get to Estonia back then, there was no airport flying into Estonia. You had to fly into Finland and then take a barge from Finland over to Estonia, and then I had to drive for it was some ungodly amount of hours to pretty much the Russian border to work on an archaeological site. And I did not have the confidence in myself when I did that. When the Poland opportunity came up, and the reason why I say I hadn't married my wife yet, we actually have family in Finland. So today, if I'd been given the same opportunity, family would have met me at the airport, taken me over on the barge, would have gone over on the barge with me, got me to where I wanted to go, and things like that. I didn't have those opportunities then, or I would have gone to Estonia and ended up working in Estonia instead of Poland. But Poland ended up being great. There are lots of Polish Americans, and the great city of Chicago offers direct flights to Warsaw. From Warsaw, you can hop on a plane and get to Poznan, and so it was very easy, and somebody would meet me at the airport. So it was very easy to get over there, and so I had the opportunity, and I took it. I ended up spending, I think, 6 to 8 weeks there. It was probably closer to 8 weeks. Working on 2 sites, and Audrey actually told me this question was going to come up, so I actually found some photos. Now, I'd love to say I had a PowerPoint of this stuff, and I do have a PowerPoint that I do give on the history of Poland and stuff like that, but I didn't bring it. But I actually end up working at a lot of different sites. Most people can't believe the kind of things I've worked on. So I'm just going to hold a bunch of pictures up to the screen. These are going to sound old school. But this one here, which I think you can see in front of me, this is a human being that was excavated outside of Giech in west central Poland. And if you'll notice, he has a little thing sticking out of his eye. You kind of see something stuck in his eye. That represents a stake, and that's actually a Polish vampire from the 10th or 11th centuries that I worked on while I was there. I also worked on things such as I got to crawl around in catacombs, such as the parish church. And here's a partially mummified skeleton of a Polish hussar dating to about the 16th century, so 1500s in this case. So the other guy was much earlier, but I ended up working on a large number of human remains while I was out there. And the primary focus of what I was actually in Poland for, not just to dig up human bodies. I was very interested in actually the same stuff I'd been interested in San Marcos, which is San Marcos had been a place, a historical location associated with the Pueblo revolt. Now, in the case of San Marcos, they ended up warning the Spanish, but then eventually joined in the revolt and abandoned the Pueblo. The site of Giech had been the sign of another, the place of another non-Christian uprising against the first Catholic kings of Poland. And where I was working was in the burial grounds for the people who were non-Christian. So those people thought that were still following traditional Slavic beliefs, those Nordic peoples that had come in, the so-called Vikings, as it were, that had non-Christianized, as well as the Jewish population, and to some extent the Turkish peoples that were also moving through the area and raiding through the area. So we were working in the burial groups of those. In fact, that gentleman that you see there that has the stake through his eye, traditionally that was done for anybody who practiced what they considered black magics or could turn into a werewolf. Well, the Viking berserker, so if you look at it in terms of Viking berserker, which is what that guy probably was, he's a warrior who channels his rage and takes on ungodly strengths and stuff like that. That's a pretty scary dude. He takes on the aspects of an animal. A lot of times they wore a wolf coat, which is why people associate with the werewolves and stuff like that. And when they died, they became vampires, or the dead would walk again. So a lot of times they had pretty interesting ideas of how to keep these guys buried. In one case, in that case, they drove a stake through his eye, which I was so impressed by because I actually picked up a children's book while I was in Poland, and they showed the vampire with a stake through his eye. I could read like non-existent like types of Polish. I could get like the basic gist, and I was just so excited that I had a picture in a children's book showing exactly what I'd found on the site. I was so happy. He also piled rocks on top of him, so he wasn't getting up anywhere anytime soon anyways. He also had a club foot, which I thought was pretty bad. He must have been a pretty, and he was tall. He was huge for a medieval person. That being said, all of those things, most of the things people don't necessarily know probably about my career is I have an unmarked burial permit in New Mexico, and I have, unfortunately, dealing with human remains is something that I've always worked in. I'm not necessarily an analyst in it, but I do analyze some of the funerary objects. So if you look up reports in downtown Santa Fe and you go, here's a burial ground associated with the Spanish flu epidemic. Oh, look, Matt wrote something on that. Yeah, he did, because he was dealing with the funerary objects from those caskets and stuff like that. In fact, those were on Fort Marcy Hill, as a matter of fact. But I've worked with human remains populations both in Europe and in the American Southwest. While I don't consider myself an expert on it by any stretch of the imagination, I consider myself broadly focused on New Mexico history and archaeology as a whole. It certainly helped guide and drive my research later on in time.
And this is for your entire career in archaeology. What is the most ridiculous thing that has happened to you on an archaeological project?
So I could say a couple different things, and I'm not going to because I'm still a state employee. Nothing illegal or anything like that, but ridiculous stories that probably are not the best to tell people, especially in a live chat. I can remember the palace, for example, something that's PC and it's not terribly offensive, but an interesting story. I remember somebody coming up. We got heckled a lot at the palace. I know it sounds horrible, but people would literally walk by. We had like a little cage in front of us during the later phases of the project. There was like a fence that blocked the visitor after they took down the old, I guess what would have been called the old Museum Resources building. They took it down, they put a cage up, and we were working right there, and people along Lincoln would just walk by us. And one lady decided she was gonna heckle us, and she said, "Have you found any gold?" And so I just stood up at her and I said, "Yeah, I did, right over there." And I said, it's gonna be in the museum someday. And she looked at me and she said, "Smart ass," and walked off. Now the truth is, I'd actually found gold at that very location she had pointed at the year before. So I wasn't lying per se, but she thought that was there was no chance I would ever find gold, and if we were finding gold, they would have it hidden away or tucked away instead of just working right where everyone could see. And that gold artifact has been in and out of display at the Palace of the Governors ever since.
That was my next question. Did it end up in a museum?
Yeah, no, it shows up pretty regularly at the History Museum. It's probably part of a gold earring, and it's only part of it. It actually, so the part we have is a hook, and it's gold-plated silver, but then there's loops where little bits would have dangled down. And as we've gotten more interested in Spanish adornments in later years, you can actually find identical earrings to it throughout the Caribbean. So it wasn't like a unique item. It was a mass-produced item in Spain that was probably shipped, Spanish women with money brought with them wherever they went. And it was a very nice artifact and certainly something interesting, but it was kind of ridiculous. She asked an honest question, I gave an honest answer, and she walked away thinking that I was a jerk. There's lots of times people walked away and I was absolutely a jerk, but that was one where I really wasn't trying to be.
I think there's an assumption here that our career paths are quite glamorous and we find all the big sparkly things, which not always true, but sometimes it is.
I've been rather fortunate about some of the things I found, so I feel very blessed.
Which is your most memorable moment, aside from being heckled?
Archaeologists regularly get heckled. I like to think that we're social scientists in general to begin with, so our goal should be engaging with the public. People should have a good humor about what we do, and I mean, most people who go into archaeology do it because they love it, and I've been happy with most of the interactions I've had. As far as memorable experiences, I don't know if I could limit it to just one. I think fondly, when I think of work in Santa Fe, I really think fondly of the palace, which is kind of what I was just talking about. As I talked to you guys last time when I was lecturing, I have a deep love of Deming, New Mexico, which is a place most people wouldn't go, well, God, that's, Deming. And I love it down there. I find the Cook's Range to be absolutely beautiful. I spend most of my time hunting down there. I find the Chihuahua Desert very inspiring in a lot of different ways. So I've also had experiences on Ted Turner's ranch out by Vermejo Park where you wouldn't believe a city just, and multiple cities just sitting out abandoned in the middle of the forest, just reclaimed, just sitting there. And it's pretty eye-opening. I don't know if I have one experience. I guess if I had one experience that I think, now in my career, 20 years on, that kind of defines it. When we did the convention center in Santa Fe, I had the opportunity, I was mostly brought on to do, at this point, I was a historical archaeologist rather than just one in training per se with the palace. But I had been brought on to do all the excavations for Fort Marcy. And I did a lot of work on the U.S. Army out at where the convention center is in downtown Santa Fe. But we ran out of U.S. military stuff for me to take. And Steve Lenz, who was the project director at the time, asked me if I wanted to do something a little different. And so I ended up doing a pit structure that turned out to be a painted kiva in downtown Santa Fe. And that was an absolutely, unfortunately, that's an experience because of cultural sensitivities. It's not something I ever really get to talk about, but it will always be a treasured experience for me especially now that I get to protect and preserve the painted murals of Kuaua at Coronado Historic Site. It's a blessing to be able to say that I dug something, I don't want to say on that scale, but something similar that allows me to relate personally. And I think a lot of ways that maybe many visitors and past managers haven't been able to do with Kiva at Coronado.
Ah, here's a good question from Yvonne. What is the least glamorous part of your experience in your career?
So most people would say it was digging the outhouses. I actually loved it. But I mean, there was days when I was covered in human feces. For most people, least glamorous would be digging in a hole that is, 10 feet deep or something like that, filled with human crap is probably not something. And the funny thing is, you think, well, God, it's dry after all those years. Well, it mostly is. But the thing they don't tell you is that you'll get glass bottles thrown down there. And those just have a way of collecting liquids, and then it doesn't just evaporate out. So sometimes you pull those bottles out and the water would just hit, the urine would just hit you and cover you. In fact, on the convention center, since I'm thinking about the convention center now for whatever reason, I remember I had one young man by the name of Gavin Burke, probably not that young anymore. I don't think he's still in archaeology, go figure. It was after a specifically bad rain, and we had dug half the outhouse the day before, but there was this giant olla, this Pueblo olla in the outhouse that I was so keen on getting out. It was beautiful. It was like turn of the century, well, not turn of the century, late 19th century. I think it was from Santo Domingo. I don't remember which Pueblo design was on the pot, but it was a giant pot, and it was sitting. So we'd profiled half the privy. So most archaeologists, when you do a feature, a lot of times you split it in half. You dig one half of the feature, you profile all the different deposits. In this case, deposits akin with the layers of poop and lime and stuff thrown into the outhouse. But in the wall of this thing, where we cut it in half, was this beautiful oya. And of course, I didn't want it to stand there with the rainstorm coming. So I dug into the walls and taken the whole oya out. But it left this cavern like, yay big, like something like that in the wall. But it undercut the area where the poop was still standing. And so the next day we got out there, and the hole was filled with water. The outhouse was filled with water. Now it's just like so there's one side that has earth on it, and one side that's it's about half full with water and stuff like that. And poor Gavin, he stands on top of the earth, and of course he wasn't there when I pulled the thing out, and I told him, well, we got to start digging this thing. And so he goes on top there, and the earth gives way, and he falls into the wet part. He gets covered in it. And one of the volunteers comes up to me, the lady who'd been filming our project, and said something like, oh, he looks really sad, like he could use a hug. And I remember turning to her and saying, I'm not hugging him, he's covered in it. And he said, I yelled something like smart, like, suck it up, dude, and get back to digging. And yeah, I find that moment. So I don't know why I got on that story, but that's one story of.
It's a least glamorous story, yeah.
Yeah, it's not very glamorous, but it wasn't me that fell in it. I certainly got covered in plenty of times, but that wasn't me that fell into it.
I mean, part of the agreement of being an archaeologist is kind of getting dirty a lot of the time, depending where you are. So, especially when you're dealing with like clay and just like rain and wetness, sometimes it happens. We're not always looking great like Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones.
No.
So, let's see, for something a little bit more serious and to tie into the last time when we talked to Dr. Clay Mathers about the site, can you, how long have you been a manager at Coronado Historic Site, and has your interpretation of the site changed with Clay's research?
Okay, so the finding of Coronado's attack on the village. Mm-hmm. So I first of all, I've been the manager there since 2016, but I've been involved from afar since I transferred from the Office of Archaeological Studies to New Mexico Historic Sites in 2013. And I helped Clay get the work together to start excavations about a year into my return there. I helped work on the permit. But that being said, what does it change? So it changes a lot of perspectives. First of all and foremost, I think what we're looking at is first, when we talk about the name Coronado Historic Site, it was established because there was the selling of the site as being the place where Coronado camped. Well, that's not true. He never camped there. He did attack that place. And I don't think, the way I look at it and the way I interpret it, and of course everybody's open, I think it's still too early to say with any certainty what's going on necessarily, but I look at the narrative as part of a broader story that's very important to New Mexico and to the area, which is the fact that yes, he attacked this village. The Coronado expedition likely attacked every village in the area. It was known as the Tigua War for a reason. Whether it's Pueblo de la Cruz or whether it's some other unwritten about village at the time, it's a representation that the public can visit and be educated about the Tigua War and the impacts that Coronado's expedition had, both on the future history of New Mexico, but on the Native American peoples who had been living in the area for generations, and how those impacts affected them negatively. It is my understanding, based upon the amount of archaeological material we have, that the battle was probably relatively short-lived. And it may have been an extreme show of force by the Spanish to demonstrate, rather than a lot of fighting throughout the village, the fighting appears to be clustered into very small areas, which suggests there was a show of force and then possibly capitulation or fleeing, retreat. Either way, I think it's a harsh reminder of what was going on in New Mexico during the winter of 1540, 1541. And I think it's very important that New Mexicans have this discussion. History can be very dark and uncomfortable. And certainly bad things happened, but we shouldn't shy away from documenting those things or making the public aware of them. And I think Coronado Historic Site is perfectly situated to have that conversation as far as a place where the public can engage with viewpoints from across New Mexico. And there are many different viewpoints of how these people are viewed and continue to be challenged as time goes on.
Yeah, and then with interpretation, it does change throughout time as we gather more and more information. Some things stay the same, some things may change. And I think that's something that all of us archaeologists kind of learn in our education, that you kind of have to be flexible. Interpretation is never static, just like culture is. It's always constantly changing no matter what. And as we develop better technology, and we have better resources to do more studies, we'll be gathering more data and making new interpretations, or keeping the same old interpretations, or something completely different that came out of nowhere. And I know I'm speaking to a lot of docents too, and I'm thinking of how they're going through their education as docents at Coronado Historic Site. And, you know, I always encourage them to be open to different interpretations. Because again, like you said, this is the perfect site for it. And as things change, you know, feel free to change with them. Let's see, the next question is, when will the lithic study from Jemez be available?
Easy question.
Well,
you guys want an exact date?
Well, this person said it was their first day digging there, and this person found a tiny arrowhead. So they'd like to know when it was made.
It'll be published in the first week of May in 2021. Will be officially the publication date. How do I know that? Because I'm an editor for the Archaeological Society of New Mexico annual publication, and Jim Moore, who did the analysis, has finished the article that will be published in the ASNM volume. So it will come out the first weekend in May of 2021. It's already done now. It's just a matter of when it gets published, which is unfortunately about a year away, but it's coming. And then we'll have some final report on the excavations at Jemez coming hopefully later that year. But I could say specifically lithics, flakestone, you will see an article in May, whatever that weekend is. You'll be able to pick it up on the Friday, and it's good too. It's an interesting article. It probably gets a little too technical, but I think there's things that the public could also find interesting about it, and some of the unsurprising and both surprising and unsurprising things. In many ways, it's some of the unsurprising things are actually more telling about what's going on, and will be of more interest to people reading it who may be not as familiar with the archaeological record here.
Did they rebury the painted kiva that you excavated?
No. So we reburied all the human remains. The kiva's gone. The kiva is absolutely gone. There's nothing left of it. In fact, we tore out, I actually personally dismantled the floor myself. We were making sure there was no subfloor features, and unfortunately, where people lived, people died. And without going into too many details about the project there, obviously the area around the convention center was the center of a Tewa village known as Ogopoge, or White Shell Water Place, or depending on how you interpret those words, something slightly different. But the village that was there housed many people, many who died during their lives, living their lives there. We made sure we were working very hard to ensure that we had not missed anything in that area, and the entire thing was dismantled. There's nothing left of that kiva other than a archaeological report about the excavations.
Another question, I believe this is geared towards Coronado Historic Site instead of Jemez. How did the local native peoples manage to eat and provide food for the expedition at the same time?
The short answer is they probably didn't. That sounds mean. That sounds cruel. The reality is, as the Coronado expedition was coming into New Mexico in the winter and starting to settle along the Rio Grande, there wasn't enough food to supply an army of several thousand coming into the area. These agriculturalists, Pueblo peoples are excellent agriculturalists. Their population was probably in the Tigua region, or I guess to say it in easier terms, the greater Albuquerque region, Their numbers were at their height at the time of Spanish contact. The area around Albuquerque was about as densely populated as it had ever been up until that point. And they were farming large areas of the Rio Grande. When the Coronado expedition came in, they needed food not only for their men, but for their animals as well. And unfortunately, I think it was very clear to both the native peoples as well as the Spanish that they weren't going to give that amount of food willingly. And so you have the Tigua War. You have the Spanish attacking villages to receive tribute or take what they have. We had Tigua people or Tiwish peoples fleeing into the mountains to result to guerrilla warfare. And we have what appears to be a very large population decline following the war. We don't think, realistically, even if we take the Spanish accounts, which are usually overinflated, maybe hundreds of people died in actual battle, maybe at the most a couple thousand. But we think, maybe tens of thousands of people died as a result of famine, as a result of the war, being removed from their homes or possibly infectious diseases that spread through the area. So we see the area going through a sharp population decline following the Spanish arrival and attack. But we don't think most of those numbers died in actual combat as a result of not enough food and hardships brought on by the winter, not having their homes.
I have a question. Was there a lot of trading between the different pueblos that existed here in I guess it'd be called the Tiwa area?
Yes. So first of all, they were self-sustaining. Most pueblos could get along very well. However, with the resources they had at hand. However, what we see in the archaeological record is a large amount of trading. Now, it's harder to see trading amongst pueblos in Tigua's province, primarily because their material culture amongst all of those villages, the archaeological record, the things they left behind, are very, very similar. But if we look outside the region, so if we look at the greater Albuquerque area in comparison to the lower Jemez River, so amongst the eastern Caras, if we look at them in comparison to the people of the western Caras out by Acoma, or even the people further south, we see large amounts of trade. And a lot of that's done through pottery analysis and through examining flakestone resources and acquisition and trade patterns. So for example, certain types of obsidian just don't occur outside certain regions. They have to walk there. People can either go pick them up themselves, or more likely than not, they could trade. Pueblo peoples had huge trade networks that extended beyond the Pueblo area. So we see trade goods not only trading amongst the Pueblo peoples and across the different Pueblo culture groups, as they were linguistic groups. We see trade with other groups in other regions, such as those further south, obviously, in what we consider today northern Mexico. We see them with people further east on the plains. We see them with people further west. They're Native American people, just because they did not have the horse or maybe have a lot of navigable waterways, in this case, didn't mean they didn't trade. They got around very, very good on their own. In fact, it would be pretty surprising when archaeologists tend to take people and they'll draw maps of like cultural regions. They'll say these people stay, this is this bubble here, and this is this bubble here. But if we were realistically, and Native American peoples could tell you this is not escaped Native American peoples today. If we were really honest with ourselves, all those bubbles are ridiculous anyways, because people cross those bubbles all the time. They jump from one bubble to one bubble. There are even things that make our bubbles, even when we create them today as archaeologists sitting in an office somewhere thinking of things, there's linguistic areas and divisions that don't even make any sense to our bubbles. For example, a good example is Pecos and Jemez, right? They both speak Toa language. They both speak the same language. They are culturally as distinct from one another as two people can possibly be. If you walk around a Pecos site, if you didn't know they spoke the same language as the Jemez, you would have no reason to think those people with their cultural, their pottery and the flakestone they used and how they live architecturally, they seem to have very little in common with the people far out in the west in the Jemez Mountains. Yet we know linguistically they were actually quite similar to one another. So there's things like that where those bubbles just don't work. I don't know if we didn't know historically or archivally that the southern Tiwa and northern Tiwa were linguistically the same. I don't know if we would necessarily even place Taos and Picuris in the same group as Isleta. We do that now, right? But if we were to look at them and we were to ignore language or ignore those kind of ideas and we were to bubble them, they'd be two separate bubbles. One would have a large amount of plains influence, and the other would be more a traditional Southwestern peoples. And we wouldn't necessarily link those two at all. So a lot of times archaeologists create these bubbles, and then we like to think, well, there's trade between these bubbles, but people are also moving back and forth and intermarrying. And Pueblo people in general, and Native American people in general, so going beyond Pueblo people to just discuss indigenous populations in the New World, were highly mobile. Coming into the time of contact, and they're moving around a lot on the landscape. And I think any attempt to try to define their range or necessarily, and the reason I say all this is it trade or is it movement? It's probably both. It's also trade between groups. Sounds good when you take an archaeologist and you create a bubble that this group's this group, this group's that group, but whether they would have necessarily seen themselves as that, or if those, just because we see things in material culture doesn't mean those are the only things that divide people or bring people together. So people can have different material culture and be part of the same group, may view themselves as part of the same group, whereas conversely, people could have exactly the same material culture and see themselves as very different from one another. And those are challenges that we have as archaeologists.
And it also comes from our own interpretations as well, which can be wrong sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Did the population rebound after Coronado left?
Are you talking about it? So there's two ways to answer that question. One is, are you talking about the region as a whole? Are you talking about the Tiwa peoples? Or are you talking about the village of Kuaua Pueblo? Because they mean different things. The region as a whole, no, it doesn't. You see a general decline. The number of pueblos kind of it starts to take a nosedive after that. The population's decreasing. However, some of the larger villages do see a rebound. However, as we see at Kuaua, this rebound might not be because there's more Tiwa peoples all of a sudden appearing, but other ethnic groups, other linguistic groups amongst the pueblos moving into those villages and resettling in those areas. So, for example, at Kuaua, or Coronado Historic Site, we see a rebuilding episode following Coronado's work in the area. In fact, in North Plaza's Kiva sees a huge remodeling during this time period, where the ventilator shaft moves from the east to the south, and some new types of ceramics move in, suggesting that a population of Kara-speaking people, probably from the settling along the Jemez River, which is just to the north of Kuaua Pueblo. So we're not talking a long distance away. In fact, those Kara-speaking peoples, shortly after, there were probably Tiwa people still living there, but those Kara people coming and moving into the village may have made the population at Coronado Historic Site or Kuaua Pueblo rebound in the short term after Coronado's entrance into the area. So you still have large villages. Unfortunately, that rebound, even still then, it doesn't last very long, because as disease and warfare kind of spread through the area in the 17th century, that those populations will then again decline, and we'll see the ultimate abandonment of Coronado Historic Site.
Back to the pueblos in this area, how did they, before the Europeans got here, what did they all get along, or were there any evidence of any kind of like skirmishes or fighting among the different pueblos here before Europeans arrived?
So the biggest thing I would tell people is, first of all, calling them pueblos before the Spanish arrived is probably problematic. So first of all, they didn't view themselves as a collective whole. These are many different ethnic groups that may have similarities to the outsider, but to themselves, these differences were more important than their similarities with one another. And these are people that spoke different languages. And a lot of the things that the Spanish attributed as being similarities amongst them just represented basic subsistence strategies that they had to follow in the American Southwest. So a lot of things they shared were not necessarily things that anybody living in that environment and practicing that kind of subsistence would have had. In time, Spanish control of the region will force people to become more and more similar but originally they were very separate groups doing their own things. And there was both warfare amongst groups and across different groups. So people in any specific linguistic or ethnic group fought amongst themselves. These are not state-level societies with a large centralized government. Instead, these represent clusters of groups of people that share a similar culture, but that probably operate individually on both a clan and a village level. And things were very democratic, so leadership was very fluid. And those kind of situations can lead to, especially amongst agriculturalists, often tend to lead to warfare. Agriculturalists are notorious across the world. As soon as you have farming in place, you have people that have and you have people that have not, and you have failed harvests in one area when you have good harvests in another. These lead to conflict and rivalry. Land is never equitably distributed. People fight over things. So yes, did Pueblo people fight? And there's many examples of Pueblo people fighting. There's many examples of them committing acts that we would consider brutal. They're no different than Native American peoples are no different from any other peoples in that regard. However, they were not bloodthirsty. They operated, their violence was caused by the same things that violence has been caused for across the world. There's nothing different. There's nothing in their society to say that they are more warlike. In fact, as far as people go, I think you could make the argument that in the Americas, in terms of looking at some comparable populations and in the ways societies formed elsewhere in the Americas, the Pueblo people tend to be actually relatively peaceful compared to some of the more highly publicized indigenous groups in the Americas at the time of Spanish conquest. Did they practice warfare? Yes. Did they fight amongst themselves? Absolutely. In fact, one of the key things the Spanish did when they came into New Mexico or came into any other area was try to recognize the differences amongst these groups and exploit those differences so they would fight with each other even more. And we certainly see that, mostly I focus in on the Jemez area now. I would bet money that based upon the implied comments of Benavides, that the Tewa were brought in to put down the Jemez revolt, the Tewa north of Santa Fe, were brought in to put down the Jemez revolt of 1623. I think there are several other cases, certainly during the Reconquest, where we can see Keres peoples working with the Spanish at certain times, and certainly at other times, we can see other groups working, collaborating with the Spanish or fighting against the Spanish. These were very common, and these in many ways played out additional animosities that had existed long before the Spanish even got there. So these are not new things that the Spanish bring in. Rather, they just exploited these differences and allowed them to fight amongst themselves.
Kind of a follow-up to that. What about the nomadic Indians, the Comanches, the Utes, Navajos? Was there a lot of fighting?
Certainly later on in the 18th century, the Comanche and Navajo were a big problem. Yeah. Nomadic peoples were probably less of a problem prior to contact with the Spanish. And the reality for that is very simple, and many people may not agree with this, but this is my own personal perspective. Until the Comanches and Apache peoples have domesticated animals, most of their time is actually spent on subsistence or low-level raiding, which means that they're just trying to acquire enough to get by. Yeah. For the Comanche, really what makes them a power is the use of the horse. And in fact, this is something, so once again, pulling outside New Mexico, nomadic societies in general, especially those who have the horse, have always been viewed as warlike by Western European and Western and Eastern peoples. So if you were to look at China versus Western Europe versus the Greeks, they tend to view peoples that live in large grassland areas as very warlike, primarily because if you're a nomad, especially a nomadic pastoralist with the horse, it doesn't take many people to do your kind of subsistence. Or you can only support, the populations you can support are limited. So you can't support a lot of people. But then the people you can support, you only need a few of them to actually watch your herds, which means you're allowed to mobilize a larger portion of the population for warfare and for raiding. Also, your population, these areas which can't really go under cultivation, they can only house, can only last for a certain amount of animals. You have to push outwards to keep your population stable. So when we talk about the Xiongnu out by China, or later the Mongols, or whether we're looking at the Avars or the Huns in Europe, these groups largely come out of these Eurasian steppes on horseback and are considered very, very warlike, primarily because large portions of their population are mobilized to war. Comanche, when they get the horse introduced to them, their grassland environment is not very similar to that grassland environment in Central Asia. They become the Turk of the Americas, for example, and they raid and they do those things. The Apache, similarly, with the Navajo, it's largely sheep and goats. Once they have those flocks established, they can spend more and more energy and more people pushing outwards. Moreover, these livestock groups have allowed those populations to stabilize and expand. Now they're having to expand into new areas. I don't think it's necessarily that they're more warlike or that they're necessarily more violent, but rather the culture they adapt to needs that kind of outlet. And these people were a problem before the Spanish got there, but really domesticated animals made things worse. And unfortunately, in many ways, the Spanish's own policies towards Pueblo peoples also made it worse. So as Pueblo peoples are decimated in both conflict with the Spanish, but then also decimated by infectious disease, their ability to ward off these nomadic groups, to stop these raids and check these populations really declines. So once again, I'm going to use an example of Jemez here, for example. The Spanish remove all the Jemez down to Walatoa. So they take all the Jemez that are living in the Jemez Mountains after a century of warfare, after the Pueblo revolts and stuff like that. They move them all down to Walatoa. And of course, the Spanish see this as a good thing because they can establish the San Diego land grant. They can bring Spanish to move into the area, as it were. And that works for some time because they can support it by bringing in their own military arms to stop mobile hunters and gatherers from coming in. However, as the Spanish Empire declines, by 1821, when Mexico gains its independence from Spain, there's probably about 400 colonists living in the Jemez Valley, Spanish colonists. By the time the U.S. Army walks into the Jemez Valley in 1849, so we're only talking 28 years later, there's no Spanish living in the valley. Those areas have once again come under the control of the Navajo, or are raiding deeper and deeper. By the 1860s, the Navajo raids have reached as far east as Tiwa-speaking Pueblo. They are literally on the outskirts of Santa Fe raiding, which gets into a whole nother discussion about solving the Navajo raids, which led to a terrible act by the U.S. government with the establishment of Bosque Redondo. But these populations, in many ways, these problems were created by European arrival and European policies in New Mexico. Not necessarily the counterbalance prior to that time was actually fairly stable, or at least I think it was.
Because we're using a lot of Spanish accounts to describe different peoples that are in the Southwest. You have to remember these authors, these Spanish accounts, they had an end game in mind. They were not like anthropologists, the early anthropologists trying to document cultures. Their end game was to send letters to the Spanish crown and getting the Spanish crown to give them resources. So, for example, if you went to Mexico City and you saw that beautiful city that is Tenochtitlan, you're going to tell the crown that these people are warlike, send guns, send ships, send all your people, So there's always an end game when you read those Spanish texts, and that's to promote the Spaniards and their own expeditions and what resources they can get from Spain. A lot of the categories that we have for warlike or docile, it kind of comes from that.
Yeah, I guess in that way, what I would say is indigenous resistance should not necessarily be viewed as a condition towards whether you determine somebody is warlike or not. So just the fact that you resist a colonial power is probably not the best way. There were plenty of peoples who decided to work with the Spanish, who are perhaps just as warlike, who don't necessarily get that reputation, and certainly peoples who just decided that they didn't want to go along with the system were often considered very warlike, even though they really had no, in the archaeological record, evidence of being that warlike at all.
Matt, you've written about a wide variety of things and a wide variety of interests. Have you ever thought about what the archaeoastronomy of this area?
No, and there's a short reason. First of all, for archaeoastronomy to work really well, you have to be really versed in hard science, specifically astronomy. Astronomy was not my strong point. So the way I look at it is, of course, they understood the stars. Of course, they understood the seasons. In essence, Native American peoples in this area, the American Southwest, and I've said this multiple times, fundamentally, to start with, the American Southwest is marginal for agriculture. It's marginal. We would not think that to feed America by planting crops here in New Mexico along the Rio Grande. We do a little bit of that, but we really would never think of this area as highly productive. And yet agriculturalists, prior to contact, flourished in this area. These were extraordinarily, if you're in Illinois, for example, if you throw a piece of corn in Illinois, it will probably, just by inadvertently landing on the ground, grow something. And so the great civilizations of Cahokia, and I'm not putting anything against them, they could grow a lot of corn. Good on them. But the people in the Southwest could grow a lot of corn in an area where you should not be able to grow a lot of corn. And in fact, while we have had some environmental degradation, most Pueblo sites or most Native American sites, you go to in the American Southwest, the first question you should be asking is, how did they ever grow enough corn in this area to survive? And these people were doing that through charting the seasons and being very, very smart about knowing when to plant, when not to plant. All of this comes out of, to some extent, a focus on archaeoastronomy. So their knowledge of their environment, their seasons, and telling time was highly advanced. And certainly as people have gone on to explore rock art and see those things more and more, I think there's a lot that can be learned from that. However, it's not my cup of tea. When I look at rock art, I think that is a beautiful expression of culture. And I think of it as beautiful art, just like I do the murals. I look at it as not only, and for me, it's not religious. Of course, for many indigenous peoples today, Native American peoples today, it still has religious connotation. But for me, as an outsider, I look at it as a tremendous written record of the beauty and complexity and the sheer fantasticness of indigenous cultures in the American Southwest. And rock art really all throughout the country and throughout the world is just a beautiful expression of traditional cultures throughout the world. I mean, I use a lot of promo pictures of myself with rock art for Puerto Rico because Taino rock art for me speaks to me. But there are lots of different areas where you can see beautiful expressions like that. And I think certainly we can learn a lot from recording rock art, but also just appreciating it as an art. I think in many ways, I've thought this certainly here at Coronado, in many ways the murals at Kuaua are a gateway for people who may not have an interest in history per se, but have an appreciation for art. It can be a gateway to bringing new people in to exploring Native American culture and educating people about the fantastic cultures of the many different peoples that lived in New Mexico and throughout the Southwest prior to the European arrival, and who still live here today. So I find it highly rewarding, but it is not my. I have written a lot. I think well over 400 articles on all sorts of things. I've never. Well, I take that back. I have tackled rock art, but minusculely, and most of it. I'm going to be honest. The most famous thing I did that's even similar to rock art was Spanish. What are sometimes called arbor glyphs, which are and they were sheep herders. Most of what I actually did was sheep herders in the early 20th century carving their names into trees in and around Angel Fire, and how to track those Spanish families that have been herding sheep there for generations. And some of it's very pornographic, so it's more like the I guess the Playboy or penthouse of rock art, as you were. But it's something that interests me still, because once again, it's a cultural expression of these lonely sheep herders, which it must have been a very sad life, lonely life out there. But it's interesting to me, but it's not something I've spent a lot of time on now. I can appreciate it without necessarily being in the know, for example. And I still think it's hard too, because a lot of those things, well, you can use hard science to link it up with certain events in the sky and stuff like that, and charting the stars. I think there's something in that. You're still applying a Western approach to it, which is not the way I think indigenous people would have necessarily approached it. So I sometimes not necessarily question the connections, but I question the conclusions that come out of some of that work, because you're looking at it from a very Eurocentric viewpoint. Trying to go back onto a people that would have had they did not have a Western or Copernican tradition of viewing the stars in that way. So even though it lines up and it matches with what you know in the Western society, I'm not sure it meant the same thing to them. But that probably goes with a lot of things, including archaeology, just to be clear.
Well, I wish we had time to discuss that a little bit more, but we are actually 10 minutes over our time limit.
That's fine. I've talked enough, and we all know I love to talk. So that's probably good.
That's why we had you on here.